be available to you on the Safe Bay YouTube channel. So at this point, I am going to throw it over to Emma.
Hi everyone, like Michelle said, my name's Emma. I'm coming to you from the UK and I use she, her pronouns. So just now the presentation we have is centering the disability experience, and our presenters are Rachel and Effie. I'll allow them to introduce themselves in a second. They come to us from Kintsugi Consulting, I hope I'm saying that right, and their presentation today is basically going to focus on the fact that disabled youth are at increased risk of abuse because of their marginalisation in education and conversations about sexuality and consent. So they're going to be talking about that and how we can adapt education to be more inclusive of their experience. So I'll just hand over to Rachel and Effie now. Thanks everyone.
Awesome, thank you so much, Emma. Do you think that you can give me screen sharing so I can pull up our presentation?
Yeah, sorry, we'll get that sorted for you just now.
Okay.
Michelle, do you have the capability to do that?
Oh, I see it now. Okay, I got it. Okay, Emma, can you see the screen?
Yeah, that's perfect, Rachel.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, thank you for the introduction. We're going to be talking about centering the disability experience, normalizing sexuality. We're with Kintsugi Consulting, which is a disability consultation service that I started last March in order to provide organizations and communities the opportunity to learn more about disabilities, disability history, and disability inclusion through accessibility and awareness trainings, and really to help combat those myths and stigmas that are still very much common belief so that we can create more inclusive spaces that represent members of the disability community. So my name is Rachel Kaplan. I use she, her pronouns. I am not on camera right now. I just had eye surgery on Tuesday, and so it's not a very pretty look right now. And so I want to spare you guys what that looks like. There's a lot of information on your screen. The big things that I want you to know about me are that I have over 10 years of experience working with disability advocacy, with domestic violence awareness, sexual assault, rape crisis support services, mental health advocacy. I have a master's degree in public health from the University of South Carolina, and I have a master's certificate in drug and addiction studies. So I'm very familiar in working in this space of promoting inclusion and education and awareness for people with disabilities. I'm an advisory board member and an adjunct trainer with Elevatus Training, which is a sexual health curriculum company that focuses on health education resources for adults and youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I also have a disability myself. I have a chronic health condition. So I can come from that perspective of also being a member of the disability community. And I have experienced domestic violence as well. So when we're talking about kind of the intersection of interpersonal violence and disability and having resources and education available, I had the privilege of having education and resources available to me and supports. And I even had this, the mentality of this could never happen to me. And so what's really important to me is making sure we highlight all of this information for somebody who may not have even had the privilege or the opportunity to have the resources that I did. Effie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. My name is Effie Francis. My pronouns are they, them. It says or, but also he, him. And I am coming into this training from a background as a disability activist as well as a self-advocate. So have also a bunch of information on this slide. So I'm just gonna kind of highlight the things I feel like are most important about me. I am multiply disabled. This includes physical disability. I am a manual wheelchair user, and I consider myself neurodivergent, as I am autistic. And I also have not quite as extensive as Rachel, but what's really funny is I got my start in professional disability advocacy working with Rachel at a Center for Independent Living here in South Carolina. So I kind of entered the community fairly young. I was in my early 20s and started my advocacy journey by working with other young adults with disabilities. So really taking that peer-based approach, and then learning pretty much the entire time. I was also helping build these professional skills with people my age who were also disabled. Other interesting things about me that I would want to highlight: I am transgender, multiple pronouns, as I mentioned. I tend to prefer he, him. And I am just super, super excited to be here presenting with Rachel for y'all on this topic today. It's something I'm really passionate about, and one of the things that I really took a strong point on my advocacy work was sexual health for disabled young adults. So super excited to be here.
Yeah, we are very excited to help kind of start off this whole Safe Bay Summit. So thank you, everybody, for joining, for attending, and for having us and letting us be kind of the first presentation you see. So just very quickly, and Emma, you did pronounce it right. So congratulations, because it doesn't sound like what it looks like. Kintsugi, it's a Japanese art form. I just really quickly want to highlight why that's the name that this consulting company chose. Is Kintsugi is the Japanese tradition and art of mending broken pottery. So it's this idea that when something breaks, it is not completely broken or useless, that it can be put back together and fused with gold or silver so that the item can still be used, and that the cracks that are filled ends up creating this very beautiful piece of usable art that has a story and a history. And so it's this art form that encourages growth and acceptance of flaws and the opportunity to see beauty in diversity. And that's where Effie and I feel like we can come in, is we can come into communities and organizations, and we can bring this education and this often missed opportunity to talk about the disability population and provide some education and some advocacy so that services moving forward and discussions that are had after we come in can include people with disabilities. So there may be some cracks in the way that services are provided. We want to fill those cracks to make sure people with disabilities are included in those conversations. So we're very excited to be here. So Effie, do you want to kind of lay the groundwork for how this is going to go today?
Absolutely. So some of the topics that we're going to be trying to hit today include an overview of disability and harm reduction. We're also going to be going into impact versus intention as a theory. We're going to talk about implicit bias and stigma towards the disabled community. So common myths and stigmas, including the concept of consent for disabled people, as well as self-advocacy versus being a youth advocate. We're also going to touch on the intersection of disability and other populations, including folks who are LGBTQIA+, intersection of folks, disabled folks in regards to sexuality, and then also touching on, of course, sexual violence and abuse. And we will have content warnings throughout the slide before we kind of delve into that topic. We're also going to talk about the difference between being vulnerable and being an uninformed population. And then after all of this education, we're hoping to fit into this 1 hour. We're also going to try to leave y'all with some tangible steps of how you can take this information and apply it to your work.
Yeah, so we have some very lofty goals that we want to accomplish. I think we're probably packing more into our time than we can really get into. So we're going to rely heavily on the chat. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat. We're going to be kind of asking some questions and answering them along the way during an activity that we're doing. And we encourage you to put your perspective out there as well. So please feel free to participate in that way so that we can still keep things moving, but we want this to be as interactive as possible. So we really quickly wanted to give you an overview of what the definition of disability is. Because if you were to Google the definition of disability or look in maybe an outdated dictionary for the term, it's going to end up being not very comprehensive and ends up being a little bit stigmatizing. So it doesn't really provide an adequate description. So this definition of disability is from the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it defines disability as a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits or impacts one or more major life activities that impact daily living. So this can include somebody who has a history or a record of a disability. So maybe somebody who they have doctor's notes, right, of having a disability, of a diagnosis, or it can be somebody who is perceived by themselves or others to have some kind of impairment. So basically something that impacts your day-to-day living in one or more ways. And the ADA doesn't specifically list out all of the different types of disabilities and different categories. So we just listed a couple of them on the screen, because what Effie and I have found is that people have a better understanding of disability when they're talking about visible disabilities. So disabilities that somebody can see by looking at someone. And those are usually physical disabilities. Sometimes if somebody has a visual or auditory disability, you can tell that they have one. Maybe they use a seeing eye dog or a cane, or they need some kind of ASL interpretation. But there are a lot of invisible disabilities that also fall under this category. So chronic health conditions, emotional disabilities, mental health disabilities, intellectual or developmental. And a couple that I do want to specifically state that fall under the category of disability are HIV/AIDS and alcohol or drug abuse. Those are considered disabilities under the ADA. Effie, do you want to tell a little bit just about what the ADA is?
Yeah. So I know this is like going to be a ton of knowledge, but I do want to drop a little bit of context for the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was a kind of landmark civil rights legislation that was passed in 1990. So like 2 years before I was born, by President George Bush Sr., that helps outline how disability is defined and what legal protections for disabled people come with that. So we're also going to have a link with more information about the ADA if you're interested in researching that on your own time. And then, so hopefully, if you have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. If we're not able to get to them during this presentation, we absolutely will follow up following this. And I'm going to let Rachel jump back in talking about harm reduction.
Yeah, so we think it's really important to talk about the harm reduction model. And usually when people talk about a harm reduction model, they're talking about drug or substance use. And we want to kind of refocus that a little bit for harm reduction for people with disabilities. So we really want to aim to decrease negative consequences or outcomes for people with disabilities based on policies that are in place, the behaviors that people either associate with somebody with a disability, the social consequences. So these negative stigmas that people with disabilities don't have friends or can't make friends or don't have any friends that don't have a disability. We want to decrease the negative consequences, the economic consequences of a disability, which often there's a lack of employment opportunities. People have a hard time finding a job or keeping a job, inability to pay bills or housing, homelessness. And so if we can look at education about disability as a way to reduce harm, that's one of the big things we want you to take away from this, especially as it relates to the perception of people with disabilities when we're talking about stereotypes and assumptions and that vulnerable population versus an uninformed population. So Effie, do you want to tell us a little bit about implicit bias?
Yeah, so kind of implicit bias 101. These are going to include things like stereotype confirming thoughts. So this is when your brain notices patterns and establishes generalizations and ideals that maybe are biased. And then these ideas and these generalizations can lead to overgeneralization. And these are the concept of stigma that can influence bias, discrimination on both a social as well as a systemic level. Typically, people with implicit bias are not outwardly prejudiced. They don't think of themselves that way. And that's not really what we want the takeaway to be, is that like, you're a bad ableist person. These are just things that are influenced by how our society treats disability. So these are just the thoughts and like subconscious behaviors that you tend to learn really early on from around you. And then these ideals and behaviors can carry you through to adulthood.
Yeah, exactly. So just kind of thinking about growing up, knowing maybe you knew one person in your church group that had a disability, and you think about the way that that person was treated or talked to or talked about. If they were overprotected, treated differently, treated like they couldn't do the same things as their peers that didn't have a disability, if that's the only person with a disability that you have ever interacted with, that kind of becomes your generalization. And as you grow, you kind of, without realizing it, you start to overgeneralize that, well, that's how this one person was treated growing up, or maybe one person in my family, this is how they were treated. This is how every person with a disability must act or must be treated. This is the assumptions that go along with disability. And so it just creates that unintentional bias and discrimination. And so we are here to help reframe that thought pattern and to get you all to just be a little bit more aware that everybody has implicit bias and that that's expected and that's okay. And that what we do with it is just take that information and we learn and we try to do a little bit better than we did before. And so Effie has some really good thoughts on kind of when you're thinking about bias in the media and how to keep those things in mind.
Yeah, so one thing to talk about is how these implicit biases are exacerbated by what we see in the media. Disabled people are rarely featured in things like TV and movies and music videos, mainstream books, etc. And when they are, these portrayals are often not positive and not authentic, and they typically just further the stereotypes and generalizations we grow up believing or thinking. And then of course this, if we're following the theory of intersectionality as coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, this compounds even further when disability intersects with another marginalized identity, such as people who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, someone who identifies as a gender minority, or otherwise in the LGBTQIA plus community. One of my prime examples that's super recent of inauthentic portrayal in the media is the film directed by the musician Sia called music about a young autistic woman. And it essentially hits every point about what not to do in a film about a disabled person. This is including having an allistic actor, aka a non-autistic actor, with generally no input from the population the film is supposed to be about, working with an extremely controversial organization such as Autism Speaks, and then featuring restraint techniques in the film that actually physically harm and even kill autistic people in real life. And so this is just one example about how something like media that you don't think is being that impactful when it really, really is.
Yeah, and I think that there was even an interview where Sia apologizes for the scenes with restraints, and says that she did 3 years of research by watching YouTube videos, and that kind of just plays exactly into the point that we're trying to make, is that the media that's out there and those generalizations and overgeneralizations of what it must mean to be autistic, to treat somebody who has autism, how to treat them, what they need, what they want, those are so overgeneralized that it ends up becoming a stereotype that was then further perpetuated by this film. So we're going to talk about this in a little while, but we are very big believers in impact over intention. And so the intention by Sia was to do research, right? We hope the intention, I don't know her, but the intention we hope is that to do research and to provide an adequate portrayal of autism. The impact is that's not the case. It created a lot of re-traumatization for a lot of people and a lot of concern over what was being perpetuated in the media. And so this is just an opportunity to address those things and call them out so that we can all do better. We've all, at some point, had implicit bias, and that has impacted the way that we do something or treat someone. And I've been guilty of that. I know Effie has been guilty of that. And we want to call you in and not call you out, and just have this be an opportunity to reframe conversations. Effie, is there anything else you wanted to add, or you want me to keep moving on?
Yeah, I think we can keep moving on.
Okay.
We're laying some good framework.
Perfect. So when we are talking about intention versus impact, this is a quote by Melanie Tannenbaum. And essentially what she is saying is that we have to change the way that we think about a situation and an interaction. Is that, intention is what a person means to happen, what they want to say, what they want to do, and how they think that will go, whether it will be positive or negative. The impact is what actually happens as the result of an action. And typically when we hear of, people's best intentions, we're hearing about the person who is doing an action, right? Like committing an action, whether it's positive or negative, the focus is on them and how they tried to do it well or tried to do something positive. And we don't often flip the script and focus on the person. So in this case, the person with the disability, who maybe the intention is to provide them with protection. There's often this stereotype that people with disabilities need protecting, that they can't take care of themselves. So if the intention is to protect them, but the impact is that they're not given the resources and information that they need to speak up for themselves and protect themselves, then the impact isn't correct, if that makes sense. And so we want to focus not on what somebody meant to do and if that and how they felt about maybe doing something right or wrong, but we want to focus on that actual individual with the disability. What was the impact of the resources that they were given access to or that they were deprived of? So Effie, why does this distinction matter so much?
Yeah, so this distinction super matters because what it does is it changes the way a person or their abilities is perceived. So like Rachel has been talking about, we are huge believers in impact over intent. And while many people don't mean to cause harm or further a stereotype, perpetuate a bias towards disabled people, the way that that information is relayed can have that unintended result. And like Rachel said, we also want to assure you this is not a space that we want to blame people or call anyone out. Again, I'm sure we can all think of at least one instance in our lives where our good intention was outweighed by an unintended negative consequence. So we really want to take this opportunity to call each other in and use the skills that we are learning to do better, to be better, and to focus on what the end goal and reasoning is behind what we say, which is that so we can more carefully craft how we have conversations regarding disabled people.
Absolutely. So the big bulk of what we're going to do, and we're jumping right in, is that we want to address some myths and stereotypes. So we want to talk about some things that are inaccurate and how they can negatively impact people with disabilities. So we're going to do a true false activity. And so basically in the comment, when we go through a statement, we're just going to ask you to put a T for true or an F for false. And what we want you to think about are some common thoughts. So we're going to look at some statements regarding people with disabilities, and we want you to start thinking about your implicit bias. So what might impact your answers? Is it your knowledge of disability history? Is it your personal comfort level, your personal values or beliefs, your community values or beliefs? So how and where you were raised, and then societal values and beliefs. So what does society tell us is valuable or not valuable? And then we want you to think about, is this statement true or false? So keeping in mind, is this true of an entire population? So are you basing your answers on someone that you know personally or on your own personal values or beliefs? And when thinking about that, is that putting a limitation on a whole population, or is that enhancing your understanding of a common myth or stigma? And of course, there are going to be exceptions to the rule. So for any general rule or statement, there is the possibility of an exception. There are going to be individuals who fall outside of a true or false statement. And that's why we want you to keep that in mind, that your personal experience or your personal example of a statement, the answer may be different. And that's why we want you to think about, would this be true of an entire population?
And then we also wanted to note that rather than using the word normal, we prefer to use the word expected, because the word normal implies that someone who is doing something either in a different or a more unique way is somehow regarded as abnormal, which is just not true. Everybody does things differently in their own lives, whether they have a disability or not, whether they have the same type of disability as someone else, or if they have just all different kinds of disabilities. When you take disability out of the equation, people are still not doing the same things across their lives all the time. And so we feel like using language purposefully and talking about expected behavior and expected outcomes versus normal outcomes is more inclusive.
Yep, we do. So Effie, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, so this is going to be our first statement that we're going to have y'all in the chat box answer with a T for true, F for false. And the statement is, people with disabilities cannot give consent. So we're going to kind of let folks answer on that. Seeing a lot of F's. That's awesome, because the answer is false. And so some things to think about why the statement is untrue is that people with disabilities can give consent, just like flat across the board. There might be some instances where this might not be true. That's correct. And some of those examples would be when someone has legal guardianship and can't make their own decisions in the legal sense. But that doesn't apply to all questions regarding consent. Say when someone has an intellectual or a cognitive disability that impacts their ability to truly understand the question being asked of them. And then also when we're talking about consent, what activity or instance are we most often referring to? That's going to be sexual activity, right? But it doesn't just stop there. What other areas can you think of in day-to-day life may be opportunities to ask for or provide consent? And so the underlying concept when we're discussing consent really falls back to decision-making and self-advocacy.
Yep, so there are kind of 3 steps to self-advocacy that Effie and I like to talk about when it comes to self-advocacy for people with disabilities, and for anybody really, but typically, especially youth with disabilities, aren't being taught self-advocacy skills. So it's, knowing what you want as a unique individual so that you can make those decisions. And those can be from very small to very large. Expressing those needs and wants to others based on your own discretion. So you get to choose who helps you and what that help looks like. And then the 3rd step is asking for assistance and support when it's needed. So all of these skills for self-advocacy and decision-making, they directly relate to consent. If we're not empowering young people, especially with disabilities, to know that even the smallest decision that they make matters, and that they're allowed to ask questions, they're allowed to speak up, they're allowed to say who can and cannot help them with something, and helping them figure out what they want. If they don't know that with day-to-day decisions, then we get into some topics like sexual consent, where they've never been given information. And so they don't know that they can make a decision for themselves. They don't know how to express that, how to ask for help, and how to really express their own needs. So if you would like to, in the chat, we're going to keep moving through, but we really want you to think about what are some day-to-day activities where self-advocacy and decision-making can be made. So, thinking as small as deciding when somebody brushes their teeth, when they wake up, what they wear. So really thinking about what does self-advocacy mean and how do those activities incorporate consent? And I know those are very big questions. So if you need to just mull them over, that's something that Effie and I are more than happy to talk to you about after this presentation, if you would like, because those are some pretty big topics. We could do a training just on this, and that would take an hour. So the next statement, if you want to put either a T for true or an F for false in the chat, people with disabilities can't understand someone without a disability. Let's see. Okay. So I see, I see some answers coming in. So I see a lot of F for false, and that is the answer. The answer is false. And this is just really important to understand and acknowledge, because we want to make sure that wherever you are in your personal or professional lives, that you're providing services or resources, having conversations, giving educational opportunities that reflect everyone. If the assumption is that people with disabilities can't understand you because you don't have a disability, then that means that you might not cater that information to them, and that they might be left out of some really important information. All right. And these slides, we'll have a PDF of the slides available after this. I know there was a question in the chat about that. Effie, we have about 10 minutes. So if you would like to jump into this next one.
Yeah, so another statement that we want y'all to answer, T for true, F for false, is that people with disabilities can be part of the LGBTQ community. And I'll go ahead and state that one as a T for true, because that is hats I wear as well. And this is going to kind of go in along with our next slide, which is some statistics. I'm not going to read all of them to you. And again, we'll have this information available and these slides available after this presentation. But I do want to highlight some numbers that I feel are incredibly important to acknowledge right now, which is that an estimated 3 to 5 million LGBT people have disabilities. This includes 2 in 5 transgender adults, 1 in 4 LGBT adults, and this is data that was collected in California. And so one of the things we want to highlight is that it's super, super important to consider the intersections of things like sexual orientation, gender identity, race, immigration status, like the list goes on. You can't just look at disability through one lens. It's really important to consider what other identities and marginalized ones that are marginalized most often, how they compound upon each other.
Absolutely. So for the next slide, we just want to do a content warning. We're going to mention some statistics for violent crimes and sexual assault, domestic violence. We wanted you to be prepared for that. The next statement, T for true, F for false in the chat. People with disabilities have sexual urges. Okay. And so that is true. Again, there are exceptions to the rule, and that's not based on disability, that's based on an individual and their choices and preferences. But there's often this incorrect perception that people with disabilities, especially people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, are asexual or they aren't interested in sex. And therefore, they don't need sexual health information and advocacy skills, such as consent or abuse prevention information about healthy relationships and boundary setting. And that's not true. And so we want to, we're going to, for the sake of time, roll this into the next one. But the statement, it's okay to abuse people with disabilities, they don't understand what's happening, that's also false. So this is a false statement. And we want to show you some statistics to really get you to understand why we're here, why Effie and I are here to tell you about this, is that we know that the statistics about sexual assault and sexual violence for somebody without a disability, and those rates and ratios are pretty high. Effie and I are from South Carolina. South Carolina currently ranks 11 in the nation for the rate of women killed by men in domestic homicide. So we know that this is an issue, and we know that you all are here at this Safe Bay Summit because this is a priority area for you to talk about and to have more education. And so we want to make sure that people with disabilities are a part of this conversation and get you to understand why they are more at risk, what those statistics look like. So Effie, do you want to just read off a couple of those statistics?
Yeah, so disabled people, specifically those who are not institutionalized, are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience violent crimes. Same thing, people with disabilities not institutionalized are at 40% greater risk of intimate partner violence, especially severe violence. And again, this is compounded when there's increased risk of violence for these intersecting identities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, folks who fall into the community of LGBTQIA+. Again, the list goes on. So these are some really important things that we want to highlight. And again, this is why we're here talking to you today, is we want to help provide this education. So Rachel, I think we can go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Yeah, so we're just going to briefly touch on this because I want us to get to really like the next steps section, but this is a content warning about ableist violence by caregivers or filicide. So Effie, really quickly, do you want to kind of sum up why does disability change public perception? Like, what does that do?
Right. So for this slide, we've got a couple of screenshots of some tweets off Twitter. And again, you will be able to kind of read these a little more in depth with the resources we have after the presentation. But the bulk of what we're trying to get at here is that when we're talking about violence enacted towards disabled people, especially in the form of things like murder, suicide, whether by either a sexual partner or a family member, a friend, and honestly, in the disability community, most often by parents or caregivers. And again, this is, you know, a really uncomfortable conversation to have, but one that obviously really needs having, and which is that there seems to be a different set of reactions, standards, and expectations when it comes to a victim of violence having a disability. One quick example I want to throw out is there is some pretty scary rates and stories out there about young adults or adults with disabilities who are murdered by caregivers, who can often also be parents. And we just wanted to touch on the fact of how these stories are framed by the media, which is quite often that the caregiver was under a lot of stress, that it is incredibly difficult to take care of a disabled child, of you know, a person with a disability that you're working with. And what it does is it really frames the action as, well, these disabled lives aren't worth living. And that's something we really want to highlight, is that we need to reframe that perception onto what message we're sending out about what it's like to live with a disability. And when these stories happen, we're telling the world that it's okay for you to be killed because you have a disability. And that's something we want to change.
Yeah, we want to, again, address those implicit biases, that there's some kind of justification or reason that makes it okay that somebody killed another person with a disability. Because what that does is it reaffirms the incorrect belief that a disabled person's life doesn't matter as much as somebody without a disability. And that's what we're kind of talking about with all of these statistics and access to resources, is that if somebody's seen as less than or not needing the information, they aren't provided the education that they need to be able to make decisions and keep themselves safe. So another statement, people with disabilities only date other people with disabilities, that is false. I'm going to go ahead and roll through because I know we're at our time. That is false. People can date others that have a disability, that don't have a disability, that have different disabilities. There are 2 resources that we'll provide to you in that Google Drive. There's a video that talks about disability and dating, and what some discussion questions that you can go through afterwards about, like, inter-able dating, and addressing some of those assumptions that people have about someone with a disability being vulnerable and incapable of dating somebody without a disability, because that, again, is sending the wrong message. And then we have some information about a real life couple, Shane Burkaw, who has written books that we really encourage you to check him out. He's in a relationship he's now married to someone who does not have a disability, and she is often assumed to be his nurse. So again, what we're doing is we're infantilizing people with disabilities and saying that they aren't sexually desirable, that they don't need information about relationships and healthy boundary setting. And that's where we get into those dangerous areas of not providing people with the resources that they need. So this is the big part that Effie and I want to leave you with, because I know we're out of time. So the difference between vulnerable versus uninformed. So what's the difference between being perceived as a vulnerable population versus being perceived as an uninformed population? So vulnerable is when information is withheld, or there's a lack of information for a person because they have a disability. They're not given access to information. When a person with a disability is perceived as an uninformed population, the education and knowledge transfer is prioritized.
And when we're looking at vulnerable populations, we're saying that these are folks who are at a higher risk for abuse or assault. When we're discussing an uninformed population, we're talking about a lower risk of abuse or assault, because these individuals then have the opportunity to be informed and have practiced important skills that can be related to consent, to identifying red flags, and being able to make healthy decisions for themselves.
Yep. So again, a vulnerable population is less likely to know their rights because information is withheld from them. An uninformed population is more likely to know their rights because the focus is placed on education and preventative actions.
Vulnerable population, less likely to know how to self-advocate and be able to do so. An uninformed population, they are more likely to know how to be a self-advocate and be able to communicate their needs and reach out for support. So the key is empowering people to be able to do these things for themselves with or without support at their own discretion. Another thing I really want to highlight, coming back around to, is that young adults and adults with disabilities tend to be infantilized and treated like children. And this is talking about something common called the mental age theory. And this is very often applied to disabled folks whose disabilities are intellectual, developmental, or cognitive. And so when we're framing that as an uninformed population, that means that we are providing age-appropriate education and resources based on chronological age, not any perceived mental age, as well as adapting resources to make them accessible based on the individual's disability. That's going to be step 2 of this process.
Yep. And so, our big key takeaways are that people with disabilities have similar desires, wants, needs, goals, and expectations when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to relationships and friendships and acceptance and access to essential education and resources. So whether you are a young person watching this and going through this training with us, or you are an adult that works with youth, we want you to know that you can be a self-advocate, you can help advocate for someone with a disability and teach them those advocacy skills and get them the resources that they need. That their future, people with disabilities, their future goals are important, and decision-making and independence are essential in being an informed population. So people with disabilities, all of these things, it's the same. You take the disability out of it, and this is still a young person that needs access to education and information to make decisions that are in their best interests. So our recommendations are, identify the urge to gatekeep people with disabilities when it comes to sexual health information. So if there was any part of this presentation where there was that knee-jerk reaction of, well, this person that I'm thinking of doesn't need this information, kind of try to identify where that thought comes from and maybe how to combat that implicit bias. Identify stereotypes that you may have about people with disabilities so you can better serve them. Learn more about disability history and language. Attend trainings and just determine how people with disabilities fit into what you do and how you advocate. As Effie said before, we do have a Google Drive resource that we're going to have these PDF slides in. We'll have the link to the video, the Glee video with follow-up questions. And we'll also have access to resources, the resource list. And that link to the Google Drive has been provided to SafeBay, so they can provide that to you as well. If you all have questions, I know that was a lot of content. If you would like to reach out to us after this to ask questions, to get more in-depth answers, to have conversations, Effie and I are very open to that. We want this to be a space where you can learn something and move forward with that knowledge. Effie, any last words that you wanted to input?
Yeah, just want to thank y'all so much for being here, either for yourself or on behalf of people that you work with and serve. If you have any questions, like Rachel said, please feel free to reach out. And then a final thought I have personally, as someone who is no longer considered a youth with a disability, but who was, in that field, is that I want y'all to remember that independence is going to look different for everybody, and independence does not mean being able to do one thing by yourself all the time. Disability or not, everybody does things differently, and literally all that it takes to be independent is being able to make your own decisions. How you communicate those is up to you, but if you're a person, you are independent. So just want to thank y'all so much.
Yeah, thank you. And Emma, we're going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. That was great, guys. That's the end of this session. So at the moment, we'll just be starting the other session in a few minutes. The next session is for safe students identifying changes in young people. So I'll just let Michelle take over if you're there, Michelle.
Yes, I am here. So as we said, we are going to stop it now. And Rachel, if you could give me back the hosting ability, that would be great.
Okay, you should have it now.
Thank you so much.